The taxi hummed along the empty streets, the city lights reflecting off the windows like 1,000 tiny stars. Ethan sat in the back seat, his hands clenched nervously in his lap. The excitement he felt earlier was beginning to ebb away, replaced by a deep sense of uncertainty. Johnny sat beside him, casually flipping through his phone, as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on them both. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something huge, but the uncertainty about what that something actually was left him feeling exposed. He had taken the first step, but now what? What if it wasn't enough? What if he failed? "Where are we headed?" Ethan asked, trying to break the silence, though his voice came out shaky. Johnny glanced up from his phone, his gaze steady. "We're going to a place that might help you find some clarity. A place to start figuring out what you really want." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Clarity? I don't even know where to begin." Johnny smiled knowingly. "That's the point. Sometimes you don't need to know the whole journey at once. You just need to start. The rest will follow." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan had spent so much of his life trying to control every detail, trying to make sense of everything before he took action. But now, Johnny was suggesting something completely different. To let go of the need to have everything figured out and simply take the first step. As the taxi rolled on, they passed by a park where the trees were just beginning to show signs of autumn. The leaves fluttered in the wind, casting playful shadows on the ground. Ethan found himself staring at the park, feeling a strange pull towards it. Maybe it was the peaceful scene or the way the world seemed to slow down around him. But in that moment, he felt a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just a sense of possibility. "Stop here," Ethan said suddenly, surprising himself. "I want to get out." Johnny raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Okay, you sure?" Ethan wasn't entirely sure, but something told him that this was the right moment. He needed to take a step outside, away from the taxi, away from the pressure of expectations, and just breathe. The taxi came to a stop, and the doors opened. Ethan stepped out, his feet landing on the cool pavement. The park before him looked peaceful, almost like it was waiting for him to arrive. Johnny followed, his pace leisurely. "This is a good place to think. What's going on in that head of yours?" Ethan stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. The park was nearly empty, save for a few people walking their dogs or sitting on benches, lost in their own thoughts. He inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. There was something about being in a quiet place, surrounded by nature, that helped him clear his mind. "I don't know," Ethan finally said, his voice quiet. "I'm scared. What if I take a step and I fall? What if I fail again?" Johnny stepped beside him, his eyes focused ahead. Failure isn't the end. It's just the next part of the journey. The important thing is that you're taking action. Too many people get stuck in their heads, worrying about everything that could go wrong. But what if you focus on what could go right? Ethan looked at Johnny, taking in the simplicity of his words. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about moving forward despite the fear. He had spent so long waiting for everything to be perfect before making a move. But life wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, even when the road was rocky. "I've been so afraid of making the wrong choices," Ethan admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've been holding myself back because I don't want to mess up again." Johnny nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never wavering from the path ahead. "You're going to mess up. We all do. The trick is not to let those mess-ups define you. They're just part of the process. The more you try, the more you learn. And the more you learn, the better you get." Ethan felt a small wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his failures as the end of the world. He was starting to see them as lessons, as stepping stones to something greater. "I'm not saying you won't have setbacks," Johnny continued, "but the most important thing is to keep moving. Keep trying, even when it feels like you're not getting anywhere, because one day you'll look back and realize how far you've come." Ethan turned to Johnny, his eyes now filled with determination. "I'm ready to try. I don't know what it will look like or if I'll succeed, but I'm ready to take that step." Johnny smiled, his expression warm and genuine. "That's the spirit. And remember, you're not alone in this. You've got people who believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself." With that, Ethan took his first real step forward, both figuratively and literally. The path before him was still uncertain, but for the first time in ages, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He was ready to face whatever challenges came his way, knowing that failure didn't define him, and that every step he took was progress. As he walked forward, Johnny fell into step beside him, and for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like the journey was so daunting. There was a lightness in his step, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the right path. As the evening settled around them, Ethan felt something stir deep inside him, a sense of clarity, of possibility. But would he be able to keep this momentum going? Could he truly change his life? Or was this all just another fleeting moment, where Ethan faces real-world challenges as he continues on his path toward change, testing his resolve and commitment? The next few days were a whirlwind for Ethan. He had made the decision to change, but now the real work began. He couldn't hide behind the comforting excuses any longer. Every day felt like a test, and he was beginning to feel the weight of it. Johnny's words, so simple, so reassuring, now felt like a distant memory when faced with the chaos of his day-to-day life. It wasn't just about taking that first step. It was about the little steps that followed, and those little steps were proving to be harder than he had imagined. Ethan had started small. He had gone back to his job, though his boss, Mr. Jenkins, was still as impatient and overbearing as ever. The long hours, the harsh words, everything felt like it was trying to pull him back into the rut he had spent so long trying to escape. One afternoon, Ethan found himself standing in the break room at work, staring at the same clock he had stared at 1,000 times before. The minutes ticked by slowly, but this time, he didn't feel the usual frustration creeping in. Instead, there was a faint but persistent sense of determination inside him. He had promised himself that he would take charge of his life, no matter how hard it got. But then, as if on cue, Mr. Jenkins stormed into the break room. "Ethan, get over here now!" His voice was harsh, sharp as ever. Ethan felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. This was it, the moment when everything could fall apart. The old Ethan would have shrunk back, let Mr. Jenkins's anger crush him, and let the cycle continue. But this time, he took a deep breath and straightened his back. Johnny's voice echoed in his head. "Keep moving, don't let them control you." Ethan walked toward his boss, his steps measured, not out of fear, but out of resolve. "What's the problem, Mr. Jenkins? Don't play dumb with me. You've been slacking off. The reports you handed in today were a mess. I don't know what's gotten into you, but I don't tolerate laziness." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. He could feel the old habits of fear and self-doubt trying to creep in, but he pushed them aside. "I understand. I'll fix it right away." Mr. Jenkins scoffed, shaking his head. "You'd better. And don't think I won't be keeping an eye on you." Ethan's hands tightened into fists at his sides, but he kept his face neutral. He had handled this differently than before. He didn't let the criticism tear him down, didn't let it spiral into self-doubt. He was still going to do his job, but he wasn't going to let Mr. Jenkins control how he felt about himself anymore. As he turned to walk back to his desk, Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little bit. He had stood up for himself. It was a small win, but it was a win. One step forward. That evening, when Ethan got home, he felt the familiar exhaustion set in. The day had been draining, physically and mentally, but he knew he had made progress. He had been tested, and he hadn't let it break him. But now, as he sat down on his couch, he wondered if he was strong enough to keep this up. The phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Johnny Depp. "Keep pushing. Small victories matter. Don't get discouraged. You've got this." Ethan smiled at the words. He hadn't realized how much he needed that reminder. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was remind yourself that you were doing okay, even when it didn't feel like it. The next morning came with a new set of challenges. As Ethan sat in traffic on his way to work, the familiar sense of dread crept up on him again. The same old routine, the same old faces. But this time, he felt something different, a sense of control, even in the chaos. When he arrived at the office, Mr. Jenkins didn't waste any time criticizing him for the minor mistakes on his reports. The old Ethan might have crumbled, but this time, Ethan took it in stride. He listened, acknowledged the mistake, and told Mr. Jenkins he would fix it. It wasn't about the report. It was about how he handled it. This was a different Ethan, one who was no longer letting the weight of other people's opinions determine his worth. That evening, as he left the office, Ethan took a moment to breathe. He realized that while things were still difficult, he had learned to approach them differently. He was no longer trapped by his fear of failure, no longer paralyzed by self-doubt. But just as Ethan thought he had found his footing, an unexpected phone call threw everything into disarray. The call was from his mother, who sounded distressed. "Ethan, I need you to come home. There's something you need to know." The days that followed were a blur of reflection and change. After the call from his mother, Ethan had rushed home, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of what awaited him. But what he found wasn't the catastrophe he had feared. It was a moment of clarity. His mother, though worried, was simply asking for his support through a tough time in her own life. It reminded Ethan that life was rarely as dire as it seemed from the inside. Sometimes the biggest obstacles were just fears waiting to be faced. The experience with his mother, combined with his growing resolve at work, began to reshape Ethan in ways he hadn't fully understood. He realized that all of the struggles, whether with Mr. Jenkins, his fears, or the weight of his own insecurities, had been part of a bigger picture. They were the trials that shaped his resilience. Through it all, Johnny's words had echoed in his mind. Don't let failure define you. Keep moving. Keep trying. Even when it's hard, there's always another step to take. By the time Ethan reached the end of the month, he could already feel the difference. He had learned to stop holding himself to impossible standards, to stop fearing failure. Instead, he embraced each challenge as an opportunity to learn, to grow. The old Ethan would have retreated, hiding from the world. But now he stood taller, even in the face of adversity. Johnny had taught him something fundamental, that the key to progress wasn't in having all the answers, but in the courage to keep walking, one step at a time. Every day wasn't perfect, and there were still days when doubt crept in. But Ethan knew he was different. He was finally on his own path, not one dictated by others, but one that he was forging for himself. One evening, as Ethan walked home from work, he took a moment to pause on a bridge overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered in the distance, the lights reflecting in the water below. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Ethan pulled out his phone and sent Johnny a message. "Ethan, I did it. I'm not the person I was when I first met you. Thank you." Within minutes, the reply came. "Johnny Depp, you did it, but remember, this is just the beginning. Keep moving. Always keep moving." Ethan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He wasn't afraid anymore. Life was still uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an opportunity. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ethan walked forward into the unknown, knowing that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the hope of what he could become. The story of Ethan's journey wasn't about a dramatic, instant transformation. It was about the quiet, everyday steps that lead to a profound change. He had learned that growth wasn't always about overcoming the impossible. It was about facing the small, everyday challenges with courage and persistence. And as long as he kept moving, the possibilities were endless.